Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
Before the sun has even begun to lift itself over the horizon, Chicago lies in a kind of suspended breath. The streets on the south side rest beneath a thin layer of quiet, a quiet so deep it feels almost tender, as if the city itself is still dreaming. Streetlights cast soft pools of amber across empty sidewalks. A distant rumble rises from the iron tracks overhead, the low train sliding past like a long mechanical sigh. In these early hours, the world belongs to shadows, to silhouettes, to the quiet memories of the night. Dotted is in this muted world, somewhere between darkness and dawn, that the story of Larry Hoover begins. On these streets, time does not move quickly. It stretches, it lingers, it sinks into the bricks of old apartment buildings and the narrow alleys between them. The South Side carries its history quietly etched into faded storefronts, woven into the hum of passing cars, whispered by the cold wind drifting off Lake Michigan. In the mid-1950s and early 1960s, this place was a mosaic of struggle and survival, a landscape shaped by segregation, scarcity, and the unspoken rules of the neighborhood. But in the stillness of dawn, all of that weight softens. For a moment, the world feels light, almost gentle. A young boy walks along the sidewalk, his small figure wrapped in the glow of the street lamps above. Larry Hoover is not yet a name. He is simply a child moving through a world that demands more from him than it ever offers. His footsteps echo softly, tapping against concrete that has seen decades of stories of men who rose, men who fell, men who disappeared into the machinery of the city. At this moment, Larry is unaware that one day his story will join theirs and eventually eclipse many of them. The neighborhood shapes him long before he shapes anything in return. He sees the world with a curious, searching gaze. He studies the corners where people gather, the exchanges whispered behind hands, the subtle ways people communicate power without raising their voices. Even before he understands it, he is learning a vocabulary of survival, one built on observation, instinct, and the unspoken codes of the streets. For children growing up here, innocence is a fragile luxury. The rhythm of the South Side teaches lessons earlier than most would expect. It teaches a boy that safety is never guaranteed, that trust must be earned. And that strength is not always physical, it is also quiet, deliberate, and deeply rooted. Larry's early life is not defined by noise, but by silence. The silence of men trying to provide for families with too little. The silence of mothers carrying unspoken exhaustion. The silence of a community often overlooked by the city that surrounds it. In this silence, Larry learns to listen, not just with his ears, but with something deeper. He learns to read people, to sense intention, to understand tension in a room before anyone speaks. These skills, born from necessity, will one day become the foundation of an empire. But here, in these early chapters of his life, they are simply survival tools. Chicago in these years is a city divided, not only by race and economics, but by opportunity. Some neighborhoods are bathed in resources and optimism. Others are left with scraps. Larry walks through streets where dreams cost more than most families can afford. And yet, within him lives a quiet determination, a desire to carve a place for himself in a world that rarely makes room for boys like him. He notices things that others overlook. He watches the older boys on the block, how they command presence without forcing it, how their names carry weight even when spoken softly. He sees how respect moves through the neighborhood like currency, how some people earn it through fear, others through charisma, and a rare few through something quieter. Strategy. Larry gravitates toward that quiet kind of power. In school, he sits in the back, listening more than he speaks. He absorbs the world, storing details like a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Teachers see a child who is reserved, but they do not understand the complexity beneath his silence. They see the surface, not the mind forming beneath it, a mind not yet shaped by future choices, but already sharpening itself on the edges of circumstance. The streets become his second classroom. Here, lessons are not written on chalkboards, but in the swift glances exchanged between men, in the cautious way people move after dark, in the careful calculation behind every decision. Larry understands, even as a boy, that the world is not just what people say, it is also what they conceal. At home, he feels the weight of limited opportunities pressing quietly against him. The South Side demands resilience. It molds people in ways they rarely recognize until years later. Larry carries this molding without complaint. He watches, he learns, he absorbs. One evening, as he walks home, the wind picks up, carrying the scent of rain. The sky is a muted shade of blue, deepening with every minute as dusk settles over the city. Cars pass slowly, their headlights cutting through the rising shadows. Larry pauses beneath a flickering street lamp, staring down the long stretch of asphalt ahead of him. He doesn't know why he stops. Perhaps it is the quiet. Perhaps it is the faint hum of distant traffic, echoing like a heartbeat beneath the surface of the city. Or perhaps it is something deeper, an instinct, a moment of stillness where time seems to pause, just long enough for fate to whisper. He looks down at his own shadow stretching across the pavement. A small figure now, but one that will eventually grow into an image spoken with reverence, fear, admiration, or caution depending on who tells the story. The lamp above him flickers again, casting him briefly into darkness before bathing him once more in light. He does not know it yet. But these streets, these very blocks where he walks unnoticed, will one day carry the weight of his name. They will echo with stories of alliances and rivalries, ambition and downfall, leadership and consequence. For now, he is just a boy standing beneath a street lamp on the South Side, unaware of how far his path will stretch, unaware of how the shadows around him will one day become inseparable from his legend. And as he continues walking toward home, the city exhales, dawn slowly gathering behind the horizon. Waiting for the story to begin. Chicago, in the late 1960s, carried a particular kind of restlessness, one that didn't always shout, but murmured beneath the surface like a current moving under ice. The streets had a rhythm that shifted with the seasons, the footsteps of young men shaping the tempo of the neighborhoods they walked through. And somewhere in that quiet unrest, Larry Hoover was beginning to understand the language of belonging. He moved through his world with a calmness that felt older than his years. While other boys his age tried to carve space through noise, Larry watched, listened, and learned. He studied the way elders talked on front porches, where decisions were made in slow, deliberate tones. He studied the way teenagers gathered on corners, each group forming its own tribe, its own orbit, its own unspoken rules. And he studied the way people changed when they felt seen, how shoulders relaxed, how eyes brightened, how loyalty quietly rooted itself in the smallest gestures. Belonging was not guaranteed in the South Side. It was woven through hardship, through school systems stretched thin, through homes crowded and worn, through a world that rarely asked what young black boys dreamed of. Instead, it asked them to survive. And so Larry learned the subtle cues of survival: when to speak, when to stay silent, when to stand close, and when to step away. These were not lessons taught in classrooms or written in books. They were learned on sidewalks dusted with the footsteps of generations who understood that safety rarely came from institutions. It came from one another, The first groups Larry gravitated toward were not yet gangs. They were clusters of boys drawn together by circumstance, by shared routes to school, by the need to protect one another from the unpredictable edges of the city. Brotherhood often began as necessity. Someone to walk with, someone to watch your back, someone to stand beside when the world felt larger than your own strength. Larry discovered early that he had a way of stitching people together. He did not ask for authority. It simply settled onto him like a coat he didn't remember trying on. When arguments flared among the boys, he was often the one who eased them back to calm. When plans were made, where to meet, who to include, eyes turned to him almost instinctively. Not because he was the loudest, but because he understood how to make people feel steady. He never forced direction. He offered it gently, making others feel as though they had arrived there themselves. In the late evenings, when the air cooled and streetlights stretched long across the pavement, these early friendships deepened. Boys leaned against brick walls, talking about music, about dreams too fragile to say aloud, about the thin line between protection and power. Larry listened more than he spoke, yet his quiet presence shaped the tone of the conversations. There was something comforting about the way he absorbed every word, as though each person's voice mattered. Chicago, during those years, was shifting beneath their feet. Factories closed, families moved, and new tensions threaded themselves through the city's heart. Protests rose, demanding justice. Streets felt different, charged, uncertain. Amid that backdrop, young men began organizing not out of malice, but out of need. Structure gave direction where institutions had failed them. Brotherhood offered identity where society had left a void. Larry felt that pull, not toward claim or territory, but toward unity, toward the idea that people were stronger when they moved as one. He saw how scattered groups lacked purpose, how they drifted into conflict simply because nothing held them in place. He imagined something more disciplined, something that could create a sense of order in a world that often felt unpredictable. His early circles grew naturally. Boys sought him out, not because he played the role of leader, but because he made them feel less alone. He had a way of seeing what people needed before they said it, sometimes before they knew it themselves. A nod of reassurance, a steady presence, a way of diffusing fear without diminishing it. These traits became the earliest seeds of the leadership he would one day be known for. The stories of these days were not filled with flashy moments or dramatic confrontations. They were shaped by subtler choices. When Larry stepped between two friends on the verge of a fight, when he invited someone who usually stood alone to join the group, when he quietly redirected tensions that could have turned dangerous. He understood that unity was not built through force, but through shared purpose. As groups on the South Side began evolving into more defined organizations, Larry found himself naturally positioned at the center of one. The boys who gathered around him were drawn by trust, not fear. They respected the way he carried himself with calm certainty, with intention, with an awareness that seemed beyond his teenage years. They were not attracted to an image of power. They were drawn to stability in a world that rarely offered it. These were the earliest seeds of the movement that would later become the Gangster Disciples. But in these early days, the name didn't matter. What mattered was belonging, finding something they could build together in a landscape that so often tore things apart. Larry walked through those nights with the subtle understanding that choices made in quiet moments often shaped the loudest destinies. Each step he took with those young men tightened an invisible thread, weaving their lives together. He sensed the weight of this thread, not as burden, but as possibility. The possibility that unity could outlast chaos, that structure could outshine fear, and deep down, he sensed something else too, that he was becoming someone others would follow. Even before he fully understood what that meant, the chapter closes here. At the edge of a warm summer night, the hum of the city settling around him, Larry stands among the boys who have become his circle, sensing the shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Brotherhood is taking shape, and he is standing at its center, feeling its pull like a quiet tide moving beneath his feet. Chicago changes at night. Its heartbeat slows, but its shadows sharpen. And inside those shadows, young men begin seeking shape paths, purposes, names to gather under. It was in this fragile in-between, where silence lingered longer than safety, that something new began to take form around Larry Hoover. The transition did not start with declarations or dramatic gestures. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in small rooms where peeling paint curled like tired petals, where cigarette smoke drifted into dim ceiling light, and where long conversations stretched deep into the early hours. The city outside moved with urgency, but inside these rooms, time felt suspended, as though waiting for someone to give it direction. Hoover did not enter these meetings as a conqueror. He entered as a listener. He watched the currents between young men who were tired of chaos, boys who had carried violence long before they carried adulthood. They came seeking answers no one else had offered them. And Hoover, with his patient silence and steady gaze, became a mirror for their frustrations, their anger, and their longing for something more defined than the lives they had inherited. Night after night, fractured groups drifted into each other's spaces, small sets, unsteady alliances, clusters of young men whose names were whispered more from survival than pride. Rivalries simmered in the corners like unattended fires. Trust was fragile, yet Hoover had a way of stepping into a room as if the tension recognized him, softened around him, and waited to hear what he might say. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with intention. That was his power. While others tried to lead with volume, Hoover led with vision. He talked about unity as though it were a new kind of currency, rarer than money, stronger than fear. He spoke of structure, of organization, of discipline. He spoke of young men being more than reactions to the system crushing them. And in those hushed spaces, his ideas began to take root. The early blueprint of the Gangster Disciples was not sketched on paper. It was shaped through whispers, through shared glances, through the subtle alignment of boys who realized that scattered strength was simply strength waiting to be assembled. Chicago's South Side was shifting quickly then. Factories closed. Schools strained under overcrowding. Police presence grew louder, yet less protective. Communities felt the ground move beneath them, uncertain of what future the city would permit them to have. It was in this unrest that Hoover recognized an opportunity, not for domination, but for order. He saw the fear in the eyes of kids barely younger than himself, boys searching for direction in streets lined with broken promises. And slowly, carefully, he began drawing scattered pieces together. Meetings moved from apartments to basements, from basements to abandoned storefronts where dust curled in the air like memory. Each gathering carried a similar rhythm: arguments first, resistance next, then eventually a quiet settling. Like stones finding their place in a riverbed, Hoover did not force loyalty. He cultivated it. He listened to disputes with patience rarely seen among young leaders. He mediated conflicts with a calm that disarmed even the most stubborn voices. He built respect not by demanding submission, but by offering something few had experienced: stability. His charisma was subtle, the kind that lived in the margins rather than the spotlight. He did not posture. He did not shout. He made young men feel seen, not as threats, but as individuals carrying heavy histories on tired shoulders. And slowly, the shift began. Men who once eyed each other with suspicion started sitting on the same cracked sofas. Conversations that once dissolved into hostility now stretched into plans, visions of neighborhoods protected instead of divided, of members accountable rather than unpredictable, of a collective identity that meant something. The name grew naturally: the Gangster Disciples. Not from a marketing strategy, not from theatrics, but from the blending of two emerging factions, two philosophies merging into one. Gangster for the unapologetic reality of street life. Disciples for the discipline Hoover wanted to instill. The paradox of the name mirrored the paradox of the man leading them. Strength tied to structure. Rebellion tied to order. With the name came hierarchy, positions, expectations, a code that offered direction in a world that often denied young black men any roadmap at all. Still, the tone of this chapter is not triumph. It is reflection, because even as Hoover organized, even as unity grew, the air carried an unspoken warning. Any structure built in the shadows risks being swallowed by them. But in those early days, no one could see that far. No one could imagine what the name Gangster Disciples would one day represent. They saw only the immediate, a sense of belonging, a feeling of movement, a shared identity stronger than the silence that had once isolated them. Chicago watched from a distance. Police noticed the shift in patterns, meetings no longer scattered, conflicts no longer erupting at random. Older community members sensed a stirring among the youth. Something organized, something persistent, something different from the chaos they had grown used to. Yet the city did not understand the depth of what was forming. For Hoover, the birth of the Gangster Disciples was both a moment of hope and a quiet burden settling onto his shoulders. He knew unity came with responsibility. He knew influence came with consequences. And he knew that once a name gained power, it became larger than the men who carried it. The chapter closes at night, Chicago's wind moving through narrow alleys, carrying pieces of conversation and cigarette smoke. Hoover stands beneath a flickering streetlight, listening to the city hum around him. Behind him, the organization he helped shape grows like a shadow stretching forward. Long in UNCONTA, INABLE doesn't smile. He doesn't celebrate. He simply stands still, sensing, somewhere deep inside, that he has created something that will outlive him, shape countless lives, and carve its initials into the city's history. Gangster Disciples have been born, quietly, inevitably, and the echo of their creation begins to drift into the cold Chicago. Night, Chicago's south side unfolded beneath the dimming sky like a living, breathing organism. Each street a vein carrying the pulse of ambition, survival, and quiet expectation. The city, already layered with history, struggle, and unspoken rules, seemed to shift subtly as Larry Hoover and the Gangster Disciples began to consolidate influence. The air itself held a new weight, heavier in some neighborhoods, lighter in others, as if the streets recognized the presence of something deliberate, something disciplined, moving through them. Hoover was no longer merely a figure among peers. He was becoming the architect of a sprawling, silent empire, and with that role came a gravity he could feel in every glance, every interaction, every movement across the city's cracked sidewalks. The early evenings carried a particular hush. Shops closed, streetlights flickered to life, and the faint echo of distant traffic traced patterns across the horizon. In these moments, Hoover's mind worked with the precision of a composer. Meetings were carefully orchestrated, deliberate gatherings in modest apartments or the back rooms of shuttered storefronts, where whispers and ideas traveled faster than footsteps, and every word mattered. It was here that he began to establish the structure that would define the Gangster Disciples. Rules that were simple but firm, hierarchies that assigned responsibility, and communication networks that allowed information to flow like lifeblood without drawing unnecessary attention. The discipline was near military in its subtlety, but infused with human understanding and awareness that even the strictest systems would only succeed if they accounted for the ambitions, fears, and loyalties of those who inhabited them. Hoover's brilliance was quiet, almost invisible to the casual observer. There was no need for grand gestures or overt displays of power. He did not command attention by fear alone. Instead, his presence was steady, measured, and profoundly strategic. He understood that influence, when applied methodically, accumulates layer by layer until it becomes unshakable. Each decision, each conversation, each calculated boundary drew the lines of an empire slowly forming around him. He watched who listened, who asked questions, who lingered, and who departed. In these observations, he gleaned the essence of leadership, that true power was rarely announced. It was earned, absorbed, and recognized silently by those around him. The nights themselves became classrooms. Hoover moved through dimly lit streets with a quiet attentiveness, noting which neighborhoods were shifting, which alliances were solidifying, and where attention and caution were required. There was a rhythm to the city, and he listened to it, the cadence of footsteps echoing off brick walls, the distant hum of the L train threading its metallic song above, the subtle vibrations of life unfolding in apartments, alleys, and courtyards. Each detail carried information. Each encounter, no matter how small, was a piece in a puzzle he was constructing, a kingdom not of walls and towers, but of networks, understanding, and disciplined influence. As Hoover's structure expanded, so did the expectations placed upon him. He became simultaneously protector, mediator, and symbol. Young men, newly drawn into the organization, looked to him for guidance, for the framework that would allow them to operate with a semblance of order in a world otherwise defined by uncertainty. Communities observed him, cautiously respectful, aware that his decisions rippled outward, affecting livelihoods, allegiances, and reputations. In this balance between leadership and responsibility, a subtle tension grew. Hoover felt the weight of observation, of reliance, of the invisible crown settling slowly upon his shoulders. It was a burden he carried without complaint, measured in quiet reflection rather than outward expression. Within this intricate architecture of power, coded communication became essential. Messages moved in patterns only understood by those initiated into the system. Notes were passed discreetly, symbols were employed to denote alliances and territories, and the flow of information was monitored to prevent leaks that could unravel months of careful orchestration. The beauty of it lay in its simplicity, clarity, precision, and consistency. Hoover's mind mapped every connection, every contingency, anticipating reactions, adjusting strategies, and always remaining several steps ahead. In this meticulousness, one saw the intersection of human intuition and disciplined reasoning, a combination that transformed the Gangster Disciples from a street group into an enduring institution. Despite this strategic clarity, Hoover never lost sight of the human element. Meetings were not merely for orders. They were for understanding. He listened more than he spoke, gauged morale and motivation, and recognized the subtle ways people responded to trust and expectation. Loyalty was cultivated not only by authority, but by fairness, by attention, and by the assurance that each member had a place within the larger structure. In these quiet dynamics, Hoover's leadership became organic, rooted in psychological insight as much as organizational skill. The empire grew not through intimidation alone, but through the careful alignment of ambition, guidance, and discipline. Yet with expansion came inevitable consequences. Hoover noticed the subtle shifts, more eyes on him, assessing, analyzing, more territory demanding attention, more networks that required constant calibration. He understood that the farther a structure extends, the more fragile its edges become, and the more effort is required to maintain cohesion. This awareness did not lead to panic. It led to reflection. He walked these streets with a contemplative vigilance, considering the balance between autonomy and control, between influence and overreach. In the quiet of night, he measured not just the external environment, but his own capacity to carry the weight he had accepted. Emotionally, Hoover's journey in this chapter is defined by a mixture of pride and burden. The pride arises naturally from the realization that he has constructed something lasting, a disciplined network capable of moving with precision and coherence. The burden emerges in tandem, the knowledge that power is inherently relational, that every action has repercussions, and that the stability of his throne rests upon continuous observation and quiet enforcement. He is both the architect and the guardian, aware that the crown he wears is invisible but no less real. The chapter closes with a solitary moment, emblematic of Hoover's reflective command. He stands before a window overlooking the south side at night, the cityscape sprawling beneath him. Lights shimmer like scattered jewels, streets trace their courses like veins of a living organism, and the distant sound of trains and traffic hums softly beneath the urban night. In this quiet vantage, he sees the reach of the empire he has shaped, its subtle order stretching into neighborhoods, corners, and alleyways. There is no triumphal fanfare here, only observation, recognition, and a profound awareness that the kingdom he never sought to inherit has been assembled piece by piece, quietly, deliberately, and with enduring consequence. Hoover's gaze lingers, absorbing the city, contemplating responsibility, and acknowledging the weight of influence that rests silently, yet inevitably, upon his shoulders. There comes a moment in every rising empire when the air begins to shift quietly at first, like the faint change in wind before a storm. It doesn't announce itself with chaos or warning. It slips in through open doors, through unguarded conversations, through the small spaces between people who once trusted each other without hesitation. For Larry Hoover, that moment arrived gradually, disguised as progress, wrapped in the illusion of unity. Yet beneath every celebration, beneath every cheer for growth, an undercurrent of tension began to hum, soft, persistent, undeniable. In the early years, the rooms felt warm. Laughter had weight. Conversations had sincerity. Brotherhood was not just a word. It was a lived truth. Young men gathered with shared dreams, shared fears, shared histories of being overlooked by a world that expected nothing from them. Back then, they were bound by need as much as ambition. But power has a subtle way of rearranging the furniture of a room, changing how people sit, how they listen, how they look at one another. And the more the Gangster Disciples expanded, the more Hoover felt something delicate slipping, just out of reach. He noticed it first in the silences, not the comfortable ones that existed between old friends, but the new ones, the silences that stretched a little too long after he entered a space. The way conversation softened, the way eyes shifted, the way people measured their words as if suddenly aware of the weight behind them. Hoover had never been a man who demanded fear. He preferred clarity, calm, respect. Yet the myth around him had begun to grow faster than the man himself. It wrapped around him like a cloak he did not remember weaving. Some wore it as pride. Others wore it as armor. A few wore it as an excuse. In gatherings that once felt like brotherhood, a new energy seeped into the corners, ambition edging toward envy, loyalty tightening into obligation, admiration bending under the strain of expectation. Hoover felt it when he watched men approach him differently, some with deference that felt rehearsed, others with bright eyes hungry for recognition. Their intentions weren't always malicious, but the purity of the early days had become diluted by expansion. What began as unity was now becoming hierarchy. What began as protection was now becoming territory. He felt it when people began speaking about the organization as though it existed apart from its members, an entity with its own momentum, its own needs, its own appetites. Something that required constant attention and constant caution. He felt it even more deeply when old friendsmen who had once joked with him, argued with him, lived the street corners with him, now seemed to stand just a fraction of a distance farther away. Not physically, but emotionally. As though success had placed a thin veil between them, transparent yet unbreakable. The world had changed around them. Money had begun flowing with a rhythm that altered priorities. Influence stretched into neighborhoods they never imagined touching. And in that expansion, Hoover began to see how growth could twist intentions, how people once fueled by solidarity now measured themselves against the myth of his leadership. He wasn't blind to it. He wasn't surprised by it. But he felt the weight of it. Leadership had never frightened him, but the quiet erosion of authenticity did. One evening, he found himself at a crowded gathering in a dim apartment on the west side. The air was warm with conversation, with music, with the kind of pride that comes from surviving the impossible. Men greeted him with wide smiles, firm handshakes, and words filled with respect. Yet Hoover felt strangely separate from it all. He stood in the doorway between two rooms, watching people laugh, dance, argue, plot, dream. It should have felt like victory. For years, they had fought for stability, for strength, for a sense of control over their lives in a city that offered none. By every measurable standard, they had achieved what many thought impossible. But as Hoover listened to the voices blend and rise, he sensed a shift beneath the celebration. Young men idolizing the power more than the purpose. Others using the organization as a ladder, climbing without regard for what they stepped over. A few testing boundaries, chasing recognition, imagining themselves as leaders in rooms Hoover had built from scratch. He felt the burn of solitude, not the kind born from being alone, but the kind born from carrying what others couldn't understand. The kind that comes from watching something you created begin to grow beyond your reach. Responsibility had always been his compass, but now it felt like a tether tightening around his ribs. Decisions that once came from instinct now required calculation. Words that once flowed easily now carried consequences. And trust, once a simple bond, had become something fragile, something that needed constant tending. Hoover stepped out onto the back porch, where the cold Chicago night offered a breath of clarity. The air smelled of winter steel, sharp, metallic, unyielding. Behind him, the muffled sound of celebration thumped against the closed door. Like a heartbeat he no longer felt rhythmically aligned with. He leaned on the railing and looked out at the alleyway below. Streetlights flickered against patches of ice. A few distant sirens echoed through the city, their wails drifting like thin ribbons in the night air. He remembered simpler nights like this, when he was just another young man trying to make sense of a world that seemed stacked against him. Now, the world looked back at him with expectation. And expectations are heavier than any crown. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet. He sensed the fractures, small, invisible to most, but unmistakably present. The kind that didn't break foundations all at once, but split them slowly, patiently, until a structure no longer resembled the vision that built it. When he opened his eyes again, the city felt different. The organization behind him was no longer just a circle of brothers. It had become an entity with ambitions of its own. A living, breathing force shaped by every hand that touched it, steady or reckless, loyal or self-serving. Hoover stayed outside for a long moment, letting the cold ground him. Then, with a slow breath, he turned away from the sounds of celebration. The door closed softly behind him. He walked down the back steps, each footstep echoing in the cold night air. He understood, with a quiet certainty, that the empire he built was beginning to move on a path that no single man could fully control, not even him. And in that realization, something deep within him shifted, a soft fracture, a quiet truth, a whisper that the days ahead would not be defined by unity, but by the subtle unraveling of it. Prison, for most men, is an ending. For Larry Hoover, it arrived like a long, unbroken exhale, cold, metallic, and strangely quiet. The day he entered, Chicago's winter wind pressed against the transport van like a muted warning. The sky hung low, colorless, offering no comfort and no judgment. The city he had once moved through with silent command shrank behind him, replaced by the stark geometry of concrete walls and razor-wired fences stretching into a pale horizon. Inside, the world shifted into a different rhythm. The doors didn't slam here. They locked with a heavy finality that echoed through the corridors like a distant drum. Footsteps carried the weight of lives suspended between past mistakes and uncertain futures. Every sound seemed sharper voices ricocheting in tight hallways, keys jingling like small chains of authority, the deep hum of fluorescent lights that never seemed to rest. Hoover walked slowly, his wrists restrained, but his mind alert. He was learning the new language of captivity, the meaning of a guard's glance, the unspoken hierarchies among inmates, the way time stretched, pulling hours into long threads that seemed to unravel without end. And yet, beneath the surface, something familiar stirred. The same quiet observational instinct he had honed on Chicago streets returned, guiding him through this new terrain. Even locked behind steel bars, Hoover noticed patterns, how respect was exchanged in silence, how scarcity shaped alliances, how tension shimmered beneath every routine. He understood power here was not loud or physical. It was patient. It was organized. It flowed through whispered conversations and carefully measured decisions. At first, he said little. He spent long hours in his cell, listening to the layered sounds around him, the distant clang of a weight bench, muffled arguments down the tier, the soft shuffling of card games drifting through the walls. His cell was small, barely wide enough for the narrow cot and desk squeezed inside. Yet it became a kind of observatory where he watched the prison's rhythm. Like a quiet scholar studying a living ecosystem, Hoover learned its cadence. And in learning it, he began slowly, deliberately, to adapt. Letters became his lifeline. Folded sheets of paper, passed through authorized channels or discreet hands, carried his thoughts beyond the walls. He wrote with precision, choosing words that settled as instructions rather than commands. His handwriting was steady, deliberate, as if each letter carried the weight of his shifting world. Some messages were brief, simple reminders of discipline or unity. Others unfolded into longer reflections on leadership, on structure, on the responsibilities that came with influence. The men who received them treated the pages carefully, smoothing out the creases as though touching something sacred. Prison officials noticed his calm. So did the inmates. Men gravitated toward him, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Hoover asked nothing of them. He made no grand declarations. But in a place where uncertainty hovered like a permanent shadow, his steady presence felt like a lighthouse in unsteady waters. Even those who didn't know his full story sensed something in him, a composure, a quiet intensity, a focus that rarely faltered. Hoover didn't have to assert authority. It formed around him naturally. The tier seemed to rearrange itself whenever he passed through, conversations softening, eyes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and respect. At night, when the prison settled into uneasy silence, Hoover often sat awake, staring at the thin rectangle of barred window above his bed. Through it, he could see only a sliver of sky, sometimes gray, sometimes black, occasionally dotted with faint stars that looked impossibly distant. He would sit motionless for long moments, letting the cold air brush his skin, as if reminding him the world outside still existed. In these hours, reflection grew. Without the noise of street politics or the pressure of territorial decisions, Hoover confronted the quieter parts of himself, the ambitions that had lifted him, the mistakes that had shaped him, the consequences that now circled back. He did not speak these thoughts aloud, but they softened him in subtle ways, sharpening some truths and blurring others. Days passed. Weeks blended. Yet Hoover's influence continued to stretch beyond the prison walls, carried by those who sought his guidance, his structure, his clarity. Communication became an art form, careful, coded, deliberate. A simple phrase could shift the movement of dozens. A small message could redirect momentum in neighborhoods he hadn't walked in years. Still, power behind bars held a different texture. It was quieter, more restrained, more fragile. Hoover understood this. He respected it. Every decision felt heavier, every word more significant. There was no room for impulse or pride. Leadership here demanded patience, a kind of stillness that felt almost spiritual. he became a student of time. He noticed how the mornings began with pale light sliding across the concrete floor, turning the cell into a cold watercolor painting. He noticed how the afternoons carried a different energy, voices louder, tempers shorter, boredom spreading like heat. Evenings were the most reflective, the corridors humming with tired footsteps and exhausted breath. In these patterns, Hoover found purpose. He mentored younger inmates quietly, speaking to them not as a figurehead, but as a man who understood how easy it was to make one decision that changed everything. His advice was calm, measured, less about power, more about discipline, perspective, and the long view of life. But as the months stretched into years, Hoover began to feel the widening distance between himself and the world he once shaped. The streets evolved, new players emerged, loyalty shifted in ways he could feel but not fully see. His name still moved freely across Chicago, carried by whispers and conversations he would never hear. But now it traveled independently, no longer guided directly by his hands. Sometimes this realization stung. Other times it brought a strange peace. Leadership, he began to understand, was not about preserving power. It was about shaping direction, even when you were no longer walking the path yourself. One evening, after the final count, Hoover stood near the narrow window again. The sky outside was a deep indigo, the last trace of daylight fading against the horizon. A single star glimmered faintly, almost lost in the haze. He rested his hand against the cold bars, feeling the chill seep into his skin. For a moment, the prison around him seemed to fade, the echoing hallways, the humming lights, the weight of captivity. He felt suspended between two worlds, the one he had built and the one he now inhabited, each holding a different version of his name. He exhaled slowly. Somewhere far beyond these walls, his influence moved through neighborhoods he once walked, guided by people he once knew. But here, in this small cell, Larry Hoover understood a truth that few leaders ever reached. Power was never a place. It was a presence felt, not seen. And even behind bars, his presence carried further than the eye could measure. The sky outside darkened fully. Hoover stepped back from the window. His name drifted quietly into the night, moving through a world he could no longer touch, yet one that would never forget him. Time inside the walls moves differently, stretched and measured in ways that the outside world can never replicate. For Larry Hoover, the confines of prison became not only a physical reality, but a psychological landscape to navigate a world where influence no longer flowed through territory or presence, but through ideas, words, and the subtle power of perception. The South Side streets, once alive with footsteps, whispered rivalries, and the constant hum of ambition, had receded, replaced by the muted clamor of corridors, the metallic resonance of doors swinging on hinges, and the echo of conversations carried through walls and cells. Every sound, every movement seemed amplified in its quietness, demanding attention, reflection, and precision. Hoover's world had shifted, yet leadership never left him. Instead, it transformed, evolving into a form less physical, more cerebral, more enduring in subtlety. He observed the patterns of life within the penitentiary with the same careful attention that had guided him on Chicago streets decades earlier. Footsteps in distant corridors became markers of rhythm and opportunity. Small acts of courtesy and defiance became indicators of allegiance. And the hum of prison life itself felt like a network, a lattice upon which influence could be exercised without immediate visibility. In this space, power was a quiet art, dependent not on intimidation or fear, but on persuasion, strategy, and vision. It was within this space of reflection that the seeds of the growth and development movement began to take root. Hoover saw in the isolation a chance not simply to maintain authority, but to expand its form, to shift the attention of his followers from territory and commerce to education, discipline, and self-awareness. Meetings were no longer conducted in dim alleys or abandoned apartments, but in quiet corners of cells and small common areas, where whispered instruction could carry meaning, and lessons could take the place of orders. Words replaced bullets, and ideas became currency as potent as any street influence. The transformation was not immediate, nor did it eradicate the shadows of past choices, but it created a parallel reality, a network that could operate beyond the constraints of walls. Scenes unfold slowly, each weighted with nuance. In the early hours, Hoover could be seen hunched over a small desk, sunlight barely reaching the bars, pen in hand as he meticulously drafted messages. His handwriting became a conduit of authority. Each letter passed carefully through trusted intermediaries, interpreted and disseminated across cells, blocks, and eventually reaching the outside world. The words carried intent, ideology, and discipline, signaling that structure could survive confinement, and that the Gangster Disciples' identity need not dissolve in the absence of its founder. Hoover was reconstructing empire as philosophy, constructing influence as ethics. Though the line between strategy and sincerity remained ambiguous, the tone of these interactions was measured, restrained, and reflective. Prisoners listened with rapt attention, not because fear demanded it, but because the gravity of potential understanding drew them. Lessons were subtle: literacy exercises to empower, codes of conduct to instill order, and principles of loyalty, unity, and self-respect as frameworks for enduring cohesion. Hoover's charisma, once visible in posture, eye contact, and movement through city blocks, now operated through voice, writing, and the subtle weight of reputation. The emotional texture of the chapter lies not in spectacle, but in observation, how ambition, identity, and the desire for legacy shift under the quiet scrutiny of time and consequence. Hoover himself became a study in duality. He was at once the former kingpin, shaped by streets, savvy in negotiation, unafraid of confrontation, and the elder statesman of an evolving movement, seeking to shape purpose rather than just behavior. He mediated disputes quietly, offered counsel on disputes both petty and systemic, and framed personal growth as a component of communal stability. Every gesture, every word, carried multiple layers of intent, a lesson for followers, a reminder of his authority, a subtle negotiation of his own conscience. The psychological tension was constant. Could reform coexist with reputation? Could ideology temper the inevitability of myth? The answer remained deliberately opaque, preserved in the weight of ambiguity, in the silence between sentences, in the space left for interpretation. The growth and development movement itself emerged as both practical and philosophical. Workshops on literacy became sites of subtle empowerment. Discussions on discipline and structure framed actions as choices rather than obligations. Slowly, a culture of self-improvement began to circulate, carried on whispers and letters, interpreted, reshaped, and amplified beyond the walls. Hoover's influence was no longer tied to visibility, but to perception, the ability to inspire obedience, respect, and aspiration without ever leaving the cell that confined him. The paradox was profound. Absence magnified presence. Physical imprisonment amplified ideological freedom. Asterisk psychologically, Hoover's own transformation unfolded slowly, like sediment settling in still water. Extended periods of reflection reshaped ambition, identity, and desire. The days, marked by routine, study, and observation, taught patience and reinforced subtlety. He learned the art of influence without immediate validation, the power of long-term strategy, and the resilience of ideas when nurtured carefully. The very structure of the penitentiary, the monotony, the walls, the regulated time became a mirror, reflecting not only past choices but the possibilities of what could be built in absence. With discipline and foresight, he began to recognize that power could persist in abstraction, carried through thought, word, and principle. As months and years progressed, Hoover increasingly embodied duality, the elder statesman guiding the movement toward growth, literacy, and structure. And simultaneously the shadow of a former kingpin whose influence had been built on ambition, strategy, and survival in an unforgiving world. This duality defined him, shaping every decision and interaction. His presence, though constrained, was expansive. His philosophy, though evolving, retained the imprint of its origins. The movement became both a tool for cohesion and a testament to the adaptability of influence. Outside the immediate confines of prison, the world responded quietly. Followers took the teachings and implemented them subtly within communities, schools, and neighborhoods. While some saw it as genuine transformation, others questioned the motives. Was this a strategic pivot to protect influence, or was it a reflection of authentic evolution? The narration holds this ambiguity delicately, emphasizing observation over judgment, allowing the audience to dwell in the tension between intention and interpretation. Every gesture, every session, every letter was layered with complexity, resisting easy categorization or moral conclusion. The chapter closes in quiet reflection. Hoover stands before the narrow prison windows, light slanting across the cell floor, the world outside seemingly distant yet resonant with echoes of his teachings. He senses the subtle movements of his network, the ripples of instruction and ideology flowing outward, reaching ears, minds, and hearts beyond the bars. The city continues in its rhythm, unaware of the philosophical currents quietly reshaping allegiance and identity. In that measured silence, Hoover perceives both the continuity of his influence and the limitations of physical absence. He has become, simultaneously, a symbol, a strategist, and a man negotiating the weight of time. Legacy and reflection dot in this stillness. The growth and development movement exists as a testament to adaptation proof, that authority need not rely solely on force or visibility, and that ambition can find new forms even when constrained. Hoover's eyes trace the horizon through the narrow sliver of sky, imagining a world reshaped subtly, invisibly, deliberately. The duality, ambiguity, and enduring tension linger, leaving the audience with the sense that influence, once forged, travels in currents far beyond immediate perception. The weight of inevitability often arrives not with a roar, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the air. In the halls of federal offices, the pursuit of justice is a slow, meticulous choreography, files shuffled with precision, telephones ringing faintly in otherwise silent rooms. The glow of desk lamps casting shadows over detailed notes and coded messages. Each paper represents a fragment of a puzzle, each recorded conversation a trace of strategy, and each seemingly mundane detail a step toward the unseen convergence of years of observation. The hum of computers, the soft scratch of pens on paper, and the measured cadence of spoken words form a rhythm of inevitability, a rhythm that will one day echo through the corridors of power and influence where Larry Hoover resides. In these quiet offices, the investigators move deliberately, methodically tracing lines between letters, numbers, and whispered transactions. There is no need for urgency. The slow accumulation of knowledge carries its own authority. Patterns emerge in the silence, repetitions in communication, familiar names crossing paths, codes deciphered from handwriting, and the subtle structures of organizational correspondence. The air is thick with concentration, and time stretches in measured intervals, each moment bringing the storm closer to clarity. Here, the federal apparatus functions as a patient observer, piecing together an empire that, to those outside, appears intangible, almost mythical. Meanwhile, within the prison walls, Hoover feels the first stirrings of the approaching net. There is no sudden alarm, no siren to break the quiet, only an ineffable sense that the rhythm of control, painstakingly cultivated over decades, is encountering a force beyond his orchestration. Messages that once flowed seamlessly through trusted channels begin to falter, arriving late or incomplete. He notices subtle hesitations in the tone of those relaying information, small deviations from the practiced patterns that had maintained unity and clarity. The air, once a familiar companion, now carries tension, like a dense fog that settles slowly and refuses to dissipate. Hoover, attuned to the nuances of human behavior, senses the weight of unseen eyes and the inexorable momentum of meticulous scrutiny. The chapter unfolds with attention to these quiet pressures, emphasizing the psychological tension rather than external spectacle. Hoover's world has always been governed by strategy, observation, and subtle manipulation. But here, he confronts a new kind of force, one indifferent to persuasion, loyalty, or influence. The federal system operates on rules, evidence, and time, a methodical advance that cannot be intimidated or negotiated. In this measured silence, every decision, every lapse, every delay is amplified. The tension is cumulative, not explosive, growing from the awareness that one's empire is being surveyed from all angles. With patience as its sharpest instrument. As investigators track correspondence, decode clandestine communications, and cross-reference hundreds of details, the rhythm of pursuit mirrors the precision of Hoover's own networks. Yet the contrast is stark. Where his operations thrived in the shadows of choice and trust, the federal machinery functions in calculated transparency, constrained only by procedure and legal frameworks. Each letter analyzed, each recording reviewed, brings clarity, revealing not just acts but patterns, intentions, and consequences. The weight of inevitability lies not in confrontation but in accumulation, a slow, relentless convergence that no single person, no matter how disciplined, can resist indefinitely. Inside the cell, Hoover's reflections carry a quiet gravity. He recognizes that every system, no matter how carefully constructed, will eventually encounter forces beyond immediate control. His mind traces possibilities, contingencies, and scenarios, how the network might falter, where missteps could be exploited, how loyalty will be tested when pressure becomes constant. The silence of the prison amplifies these considerations, making each thought more acute, each perception sharper. He understands that destiny, in its patient and impartial manner, does not negotiate. It observes, waits, and acts with precision when the moment arrives. This period is also marked by emotional subtlety. There is no panic, no dramatic confrontation, only the quiet pressure of awareness. Hoover's internal world is layered, the pride of what he has built, the tension of what may be lost, and the reflective understanding that influence, while durable, is never absolute. The narrative highlights this psychological interplay, allowing the audience to dwell in the understated dread of inevitability, in the patient unraveling of control. The streets, the movement, and the network continue, but they carry a faint echo of vulnerability, a recognition that external forces, operating quietly and meticulously, can reshape the future. The federal indictment arrives with the same quiet inevitability that has marked this chapter. It is not a spectacle, not an intrusion of noise, but a simple, measured act. The turning of pages, the reading of formal charges, the methodical application of law. Hoover receives the information with composure, seated in the stillness of his cell, his mind tracing implications, outcomes, and adjustments. The scene emphasizes calm over drama, a man absorbing the weight of what is to come, understanding that the foundation of an empire, no matter how disciplined, structured, or disciplined, is about to be tested in ways that are both procedural and profound. In these moments, the narrative conveys the essence of Hoover's enduring intelligence and strategic patience. He considers each element of the indictment, parsing language, timelines, and evidence, weighing response against circumstance, influence against inevitability. There is no fear, no desperation, only a measured acknowledgement of reality. The calm calculation of a man who has spent decades anticipating consequence, even as he confronts forces that operate independently of human desire or control. The tension is internal, psychological, and deliberate. A quiet storm whose approach is sensed more than seen, whose power is felt rather than shouted. The broader context of Chicago outside the prison walls continues in muted cadence. Streets carry echoes of the empire Hoover once orchestrated with physical presence, yet now they intersect with an apparatus beyond his immediate touch. Agents, analysts, and investigators form an invisible web, patiently connecting every thread. The movement, though resilient, now exists under scrutiny that cannot be swayed by loyalty alone. The juxtaposition of disciplined incarceration and methodical investigation forms the emotional spine of the chapter, highlighting the interplay between personal control and external inevitability. As the chapter concludes, Hoover reflects in silence. The world outside persists in its rhythm, the distant murmur of activity, the faint lights of the city beyond bars, the subtle marks of change unnoticed by most. Yet within the stillness, he recognizes the moment of transition, a legal mechanism moving inexorably toward consequence, an empire encountering the patient weight of federal scrutiny, a chapter of life poised for transformation. The scene closes with Hoover seated at his desk, hands folded, eyes steady, absorbing the quiet turning of fate itself. It is not dramatic, not sensational, but profoundly inevitable, a measured reminder that even the most calculated influence is subject to forces beyond control. In this silence, the audience is left with a sense of suspended tension, the anticipation of confrontation, not through chaos, but through procedure. The quiet unraveling of an empire under meticulous observation, and the enduring power of intellect, strategy, and patience in the face of an impartial system. Hoover's gaze, thoughtful and composed, extends through the quiet, capturing both the magnitude of what has been built and the subtle inevitability of its test. Here, the federal hammer falls softly, steadily, but with an authority that cannot be ignored. Time in its rawest form is patient, unyielding, and absolute. It moves with a quiet persistence that cannot be negotiated, circumvented, or hastened. For Larry Hoover, the life sentence is not a sudden upheaval, but a gradual, inexorable immersion into this slow rhythm. The first mornings are measured by the soft intrusion of light through narrow cell windows, pale beams stretching across cold concrete floors. The air carries the muted scent of metal, faint antiseptic, and the lingering traces of life beyond the bars, a world both remembered and now unreachable. Here, each moment feels elongated, a stretch of existence magnified by reflection and absence. Every breath, every footstep in distant corridors becomes a punctuation in a narrative he did not choose, yet must inhabit fully. In the silence, Hoover turns inward. The hum of distant conversation, the low clatter of prison routines, and the soft rattle of locked doors form a backdrop to his contemplation. He moves deliberately through his cell, noting the worn edges of furniture, the faint scratches of past occupants, and the subtle shifts in light as the day unfolds. Each detail anchors him in the present, yet also opens doorways into memory. Faces flash across his mind, allies and adversaries, friends and rivals, young men whose lives were entwined with his own in the South Side neighborhoods of Chicago. The streets themselves, once alive with motion and negotiation, now appear as faint echoes, replaying choices and consequences in a loop that he cannot escape, but that he studies with exacting attention. Letters arrive slowly, folded and precise, carrying fragments of the world he once orchestrated. Some speak of loyalty, others of defiance. Some convey hope, others resignation. Hoover handles each with measured care, reading between the lines, parsing intention and truth. Each message is both connection and mirror, reflecting the structures he created and the lives influenced by his guidance. In this careful observation, he notes the paradox of authority. Though physically confined, his influence remains, diffused through networks shaped by decades of deliberate action. Yet with this residual power comes an acute awareness of its fragility. Every decision, every directive, carries weight, yet is filtered through layers of interpretation he cannot oversee firsthand. The daily routines of the penitentiary form their own quiet rhythm. Footsteps echo across concrete corridors. The distant clang of metal doors punctuates intervals of time, and faint voices rise and fall in a muted cadence, almost musical in their constancy. Hoover learns to inhabit this rhythm, to let it anchor reflection rather than despair. He walks the yard slowly, noting the interplay of sunlight and shadow, the texture of the wind against his face, the subtle motions of those around him, each step a meditation. Time stretches, compresses, and folds in upon itself, a canvas for memory and introspection. Within these measured intervals, Hoover confronts the cumulative weight of a life, built in both brilliance and contradiction. Reflection deepens as he considers the duality of his legacy. He examines choices that built an empire, and the costs those choices extracted from both the streets and the people he guided. Pride and regret exist side by side, forming a landscape of emotional subtlety. Hoover contemplates not only the mechanics of influence, but its moral dimensions, the consequences of decisions that, while strategic, shaped lives in irrevocable ways. He revisits moments of triumph and miscalculation, seeing them not as stories for legend, but as tangible realities whose echoes persist long after actions are concluded. The reflective tone allows the audience to witness Hoover as a man negotiating the interplay of power, consequence, and time, a figure neither lionized nor vilified, but understood in the fullness of circumstance. Within the cell, small gestures take on amplified significance. The careful folding of clothing, the organized arrangement of personal belongings, and the deliberate pacing of steps across the floor all carry symbolic weight. Each action becomes a marker in time, a subtle assertion of control in a space defined by limitation. Hoover's observation extends to the human minutiae around him, the shifts in tone of passing guards, the silent communications of fellow inmates, the faint gestures that signal alliances or distance. In this attentiveness, he exercises influence in a form constrained by environment, yet potent in its reach. Patience becomes both strategy and necessity. Reflection, a daily discipline. The emotional center of the chapter emerges in moments of quiet solitude. Hoover sits with hands folded, eyes tracing the trajectory of sunlight as it moves across his cell. The gentle warmth against the skin contrasts with the cold permanence of concrete and metal, a small reprieve from the starkness of confinement. He allows himself to drift into memory without losing presence in the now, balancing the immediacy of incarceration with the expanse of recollection. In these passages, the narration emphasizes sensory engagement, the scent of morning air wafting through ventilation grates, the subtle creak of furniture, the faint vibration of distant machinery, all creating a textured canvas upon which thought and introspection unfold. Hoover's mind often wanders to the streets, to the energy of Chicago he once navigated with calculated ease. He recalls the pulse of neighborhoods, the unspoken codes of loyalty, and the ways in which influence is both exercised and surrendered. These recollections carry a soft tension pride tempered by recognition of cost. The narrative avoids sensationalism, instead dwelling on psychological resonance. The audience perceives Hoover as a human being encountering the raw contours of existence, influence diffused, ambition constrained, and time itself a measure of reflection rather than conquest. Each thought, each recollection, is a brushstroke in a portrait of contemplation. As hours fold into days, the notion of legacy crystallizes. Hoover considers the implications of absence, the ways in which ideas, structures, and teachings continue beyond physical presence. He examines the duality of influence, how guidance can endure even as the individual remains contained. Letters, messages, and conversations through intermediaries become instruments of persistence. Yet alongside this enduring reach exists the acknowledgement of limits, the recognition that time, Law and circumstance are forces beyond even the most disciplined mind. This interplay forms the emotional spine of the chapter, quiet understanding coupled with subtle, contemplative tension. The chapter closes with a poetic image, emblematic of the chapter's reflective tone. Hoover steps into a small patch of sunlight in the prison yard, the light warm against his face, the wind brushing softly across exposed skin. Eyes closed, he inhales the day with deliberate calm, allowing the slow rhythm of existence to settle around him. In this moment, time is both a teacher and a companion. The city outside continues beyond the walls, distant yet perceptible in subtle sounds and rhythms. The patch of sunlight is temporary, fleeting, yet within it lies the profound constancy of awareness and reflection. Hoover sits alone, present in the stillness, reconciled to the temporal span before him, and quietly at peace with the measured unfolding of life within the contours of containment. Here, the audience is left with a sense of enduring calm, a man confronted with time in its fullest measure, neither defeated nor exalted, but inhabiting the slow, contemplative space where reflection, understanding, and quiet acceptance converge. Time, once measured by choices, consequences, and confinement, now stretches outward into memory and resonance. Larry Hoover's life, a tapestry of ambition, strategy, and human contradiction, begins to settle into its broader imprint, not through headlines, not through myth-making, but through the quiet channels by which a name persists long after its originator steps aside. Chicago itself seems to inhale and exhale in rhythm with the stories of its streets, its neighborhoods, its people, carrying fragments of Hoover's presence like whispers caught in the wind. This final chapter moves gently through these echoes, observing without judgment, lingering on resonance rather than sensationalism. The streets of Hoover's youth, once a playground for survival, now appear transformed. Buildings stand altered, corners erased by redevelopment or time, yet faint traces of the past linger. A faded graffiti tag here, a shuttered storefront. There, the outline of a basketball court where young boys once congregated. Each subtle mark evokes memory, a reminder of the influence that shaped countless lives. The cityscape, painted in muted colors beneath overcast skies or the soft patter of rain, becomes a visual metaphor for continuity and change. Hoover's name, like these streets, exists both as history and as present resonance, floating in conversations, in music, in reflections among those who lived within his orbit. In quiet apartments, sunlight falls across old photographs, edges curling, faces frozen in expression and time. Men who once followed Hoover now carry the years differently, lines deepened by experience, voices tempered by reflection. Some speak of him with reverence, some with resentment, others with a mixture that defies categorization. The narration dwells here, softly, inviting contemplation of complexity. There's no need to glorify, no urge to vilify. Instead, the audience witnesses the multiplicity of perception. One life has become many narratives, each shaped by proximity, memory, and interpretation. Hoover exists simultaneously as the strategist, the leader, the prisoner, the philosopher, and the cautionary tale. The full spectrum of identity unfolds quietly, like shadows stretching over a familiar ityscap. That music carries his name forward. Lyrics echo references to loyalty, power, and survival, filtered through artistry and memory. Hip-hop, soul, and spoken word all become vessels for these stories, carrying fragments of influence into generations who never knew the streets firsthand. The tone is reflective. The cultural resonance is neither celebrated nor condemned. Instead, it is acknowledged as part of the enduring complexity of human impact. Hoover's philosophy, his leadership, and his mistakes ripple outward, intersecting with creativity, commentary, and community discourse. In each instance, the past converses with the present, and the boundaries between legend and lived experience blur. The narrative lingers on small, almost imperceptible signs of continuity. In a quiet classroom, a mentor may recount lessons of discipline or unity drawn from Hoover's writings or speeches. In neighborhoods, older residents reflect on days marked by both fear and admiration, describing moments when the Gangster Disciples' influence shaped behaviors, allegiances, or aspirations. These reflections unfold in a tone of observation and curiosity, capturing the human impulse to interpret history, to contextualize power, and to reconcile the consequences of choices long past. The pacing slows further, allowing each recollection to breathe, each nuance to resonate in the listener's mind. Yet alongside these ripples of presence lies the inevitability of change. Streets shift, neighborhoods transform, and younger generations encounter stories of Hoover as abstracted legend, divorced from the immediacy of lived experience. The passage of time softens edges, the intensity of ambition, the immediacy of influence, and the tensions of leadership evolve into patterns, symbols, and echoes. Rain falls lightly across Chicago, a steady rhythm that unites past and present, washing over concrete, windows, and rooftops. It carries the faint scent of memory, the faint smoke of forgotten fires, the wet earth of vacant lots, the tang of distant conversations, and in its sound, the narrative finds both closure and continuity. Reflection deepens as Hoover's personal legacy intersects with broader social and cultural threads. The ideas he propagated, discipline, loyalty, and organization, exist now as fragments of collective memory. Streets, institutions, and families carry indirect traces of his life. The audience is invited to perceive not only the individual, but the resonance of his influence, how structures built in ambition endure beyond the reach of a single person, how human networks continue to operate in the subtle architecture of guidance, mentorship, and cautionary example. Hoover's life becomes a lens through which to understand both the fragility and resilience of human endeavor. Amid these reflections, Hoover himself is present, not as an omnipotent figure, but as a human anchored in experience and consequence. Prison walls, once confining, now feel less like limitation and more like context, a frame against which his enduring impact can be measured. Moments of contemplation unfold in stillness, sitting quietly in his cell, listening to distant footsteps, the faint scrape of a chair, the wind against narrow windows. These details anchor the narration in sensory perception, creating a rhythm that mirrors both temporal passage and internal meditation. The slow cadence allows the audience to inhabit Hoover's reflection, to absorb the layered complexity of presence, absence, and influence. Ultimately, the echo of a name is a meditation on continuity and impermanence. Hoover's story, once lived in urgency, ambition, and conflict, now drifts into abstraction and memory. Yet this abstraction does not diminish significance, it transforms it. The resonance persists in unexpected ways, in conversations that question morality, in cultural production that translates experience into art, and in the personal reflections of those who encountered him directly. Each echo is subtle, often quiet, yet accumulates into a presence that defies simplification. Hoover's name, like the rain-soaked streets of Chicago, flows through the city continuously, visible only to those who pause, reflect, and listen. The chapter closes with a final poetic image, emblematic of both reflection and continuity. Rain falls softly over Chicago, each drop a gentle punctuation in the city's ongoing story. Streetlights flicker behind wet glass, the hum of distant traffic a muted rhythm, and the faint rustle of leaves sways in the evening breeze. Hoover's name moves through this landscape not as a declaration of power, not as a mark of infamy, but as a quiet echo, a memory carried on the breath of the city. It inhabits conversations, colors recollections, and permeates the spaces between history and present. There is no need for judgment here, only understanding, meditation, and a recognition that influence, once enacted, persists in forms both tangible and intangible. The narrative lingers a moment longer on the sensory resonance of rain, city, and memory, allowing the audience to inhabit the quiet interstices of legacy. Hoover's story, completed in action, yet ongoing in reflection, settles softly into place. The streets are still, the light dimming, and the rain continues its measured descent, a final punctuation for a life that will echo long beyond any single moment. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with suspended calm, a meditative acknowledgement of the enduring, multifaceted nature of influence. Hoover's name, finally, has become a thread woven through time, subtle, persistent, and quietly unforgettable.